Hi, I'm Dr. Donna Gruley, and today we're discussing how policy is made within the United States. Most people aren't aware of how a policy is developed, implemented, and enforced until it personally impacts them. So we'll talk about the process along with the individuals and groups of people who have the most influence on policy. So what is policy and how do we define it? Policy is a course of action which ultimately influences the behavior of people. Specifically, public health policy walks the fine line between government, organizations, and people to balance power and protect the public's health. A great example of public health policy was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which has evolved over the last century and was most recently updated in 2007. This policy was drafted to protect public health by implementing laws on goods consumed or ingested by the public, including food, drugs, alcohol, dietary supplements, and other items. Before this policy was passed, people could manufacture and claim anything about their products. Above are some examples of potions advertised to cure anything. Often these products contain toxic materials like arsenic, mercury, and cyanide. Sure, these could cure anything, particularly if you died from an overdose. You'd definitely be cured of your ailment. Improvements in public safety came through the implementation of policies for manufacturers, wholesalers, and marketers of these products. Over time, this law required manufacturers to disclose the contents and provide evidence to a governmental agency that these products were safe for the public to consume. In order to reach this balance between the government, organizations, and the public, two types of public health policies are used. The first is a policy that defines the powers and functions of governmental agencies at all levels. Police powers are an example, which are given to state and local governments by the Constitution to regulate businesses and individuals to protect health. Second, protecting health through policies such as incentives have been shown to be a strong influencer of public behavior. Probably the best example are the taxes imposed on cigarettes in the United States, which serve as a disincentive to buy tobacco products. Policy doesn't happen on a whim of a particular person or even an organization. A lot of thought, debate, research, data, and even actions go into making policy in this country. Here are several ways that policy is made. First are authoritative decisions, which are made by those who have the power to implement and enforce the policy. Governments at the federal, state, and even local levels can pass policy in the form of statutes, also known as laws, or ordinances, which is a term describing policies at the local level. Organizations can also pass policy for the benefit of its members or employees. An example of an authoritative decision is to halt the spread of communicable diseases. A course of action can be developed and implemented at any level, government, organization, or even an individual. To follow the example of communicable disease prevention, a surveillance and monitoring program is developed at the state level, implemented at the local level, and reported through the state to the federal government, the CDC. Authoritative guidelines are developed to describe implementation of a policy or to develop an unofficial policy where either one is absent or isn't descriptive enough. The state of California has a policy governing underground storage tanks for petroleum and other hazardous materials. This policy is implemented by the State Water Resources Control Board through the development of regulations which describe how the policy is to be implemented. At an organizational level, the Joint Commission develops voluntary accreditation standards for healthcare organizations. These standards aren't law, but are guidelines to implement a specific agenda, for instance, safe and high-quality health care. Finally, inaction is also a form of policy decision, which essentially fails to change an existing policy. An example is a workplace formaldehyde exposure standard, which was not updated to a lower exposure level. And that was probably due to a lack of support and perhaps even inadequate evidence to require a policy change. By not amending the formaldehyde standard, the inaction communicated that the existing policy was considered adequate as it was written. All branches of government develop policy. At the federal level, the three branches of government develop, apply, and interpret policy, along with administrative agencies to implement and enforce policy. State and local governments implement policy through elected officials and administrative agencies, similar to the federal government. However, states are given more control over policy implementation by the Constitution for several reasons: balance of power, increased span of control, smaller geographic area to cover, differences in demographics, physical environment, sources of funding such as tax dollars and permit fees, and different interpretation of a national policy. This graphic depicts the three branches of the federal government. The legislative branch makes laws and is made up of elected officials which comprise the U.S. Congress. The executive branch approves bills by signing them into law or vetoes them, and includes the president as the chief executive officer over the cabinet. The judicial branch interprets laws through the federal and Supreme Court systems. Not listed on this graphic are other constituents who are stakeholders in policy. Examples include the political parties, foreign governments, international organizations like the World Health Organization, and ultimately the public, since laws passed at the federal level will impact every person residing in our country. Here's a simple depiction of the hierarchy of police powers and development in the U.S. At the federal level, general policies are made like the Clean Air Act, which is an environmental policy, and Medicaid, which is health care for the poor. For these, each state must implement the federal policy or pass a more stringent policy. The Constitution's 10th Amendment gives power to the states to implement and develop policies while limiting the reach of the federal government beyond the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. To follow the federal policy example of the Clean Air Act, California chose to develop and implement a more stringent state-level policy for air quality and has updated this law as recently as 2006 to address climate change by reducing vehicle emissions. In contrast, the Federal Clean Air Act was last updated in 1990. So where do counties sit in regards to policy? Usually counties implement state-level policies and report back to the state each year on their progress in regards to enforcement. Unless a county develops its own policy, it will implement the state's policy on behalf of the state and often receive funding to do so. This list looks similar to the slide of who develops policy. We've seen the levels of policy making from federal to state to local agencies. Now let's look at who actually influences public health policy. Obviously, Congress influences policy not only by developing and passing national level policy for the entire United States, but also for providing funding to states for oversight and enforcement. We'll discuss this more under the financial model later in PCOR. little enforcement actually happens at the federal level unless there is a challenge with a particular state. An example of this happened several years ago between the federal government and the state of California for what the feds considered a lack of oversight and enforcement of healthcare organizations by the state. With the threat of the feds pulling financial reimbursement, the state was forced to increase its oversight activities by hiring more healthcare surveyors and following up on complaints from the public. This list includes special interest groups, which have gotten a negative image recently. However, these groups are crucial to public health because they influence policy outside of the governmental hierarchy. These groups represent the interests of their members and have the ability to influence policy through different activities. Grassroots actions come from the organization through its members in the form of specific actions, such as contacting their congressional representative to ask for support or opposition to a specific policy measure. Grass-top actions utilize leaders and other prominent community officials to support or oppose policy initiatives. Coalitions are groups of organizations who unite around a specific cause. This can be particularly effective if they have a common message and a cohesive strategy. Media campaigns can effectively communicate a message to the public and other groups. And finally, funding is another strategy to help interest groups gain support. This could be funding an organization or even a political campaign. Each one of these groups has the ability to influence public health policy in a positive way. Often those at the upper levels of the policy hierarchy aren't aware of the evidence or importance of a public health issue. A recent example of influencing public health policy happened in early 2017 when a group of deans from several schools of public health testified on Capitol Hill on the dangers of opioid overprescription and addiction. They asked Congress for help through development of a national policy. It's important to be aware of key sources of policy as these are used daily to make decisions and protect the public. A constitution forms a country's government, including the rights of its citizens, and has been amended 27 times. The first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. Statutes are laws created by federal or state legislatures and are very broad in nature. Regulations are developed usually by an administrative agency and describe how to implement, interpret, and enforce a policy. Common laws are essentially decisions made by lawyers or judges. When I worked at the county, LG letters were written by the state's Water Resources Control Board and were interpretations of the water code and corresponding regulations. Because we at the county enforced the state's water policy, these letters were cited and used as part of the law because they were the state's interpretation of it, rather than the county's coming up with their own interpretation. As a future public health professional, no matter your field, you can have a big impact by driving policy changes and helping to improve the population's health, community, or work environment. For over 30 years, I've seen a variety of policies implemented that change lives and the future. I hope that over the course of PCOR, you will be able to see how important policy is and envision how you can influence policy to benefit people, no matter where they live, and their communities. Thanks for watching, and be sure to post any questions you may have about this topic on the Canvas discussion board.